It's wonderful to be here, although I must admit, if I'd known that Chilingo was from Manchester, I wouldn't have agreed to come. I don't know if there are any other Angry Birds addicts out there, but something responsible for more ridiculous wasted evenings and late nights, I can't imagine. In fact, Jeff Bezos, talking about the new Kindle, was on Bloomberg about 10 days ago, making the point that the single biggest use of the Kindle to date has been, at a cost of £150 per device, has been reading the books of Stieg Larsson. And the single biggest use of the iPad has been playing Angry Birds, astoundingly. So you develop these things, you spend millions and millions and millions developing an extraordinary new interface and technology, and then people use it to fire small birds at militaristic-looking pigs. It kind of, I have to say, I think Steve Jobs must have been slightly peeved by that. But that's the way the world goes. The other thing, just to really, I suppose, an endorsement of exactly what you're doing this evening, is anything that creates solidarity within a group like this is fantastically valuable. And if you want a good precedent to look at, I don't know the full details of this, but someone was telling me about a week ago of some action taken by the Argentine advertising industry, which always felt very much in the shadow of the Brazilian advertising industry, which in the last 5 to 10 years has had incredible creative success. And they got together as a group and they said, okay, in future, we're not competing with each other. We're not doing this work to win awards for JWT or for Ogilvy or any of the individual things. We're doing it for Argentina. And we'll actually do anything we can to help each other. And when one of you wins an award, I'll see it as my award. Which is an example of, I suppose, a sort of paradigm shift in thinking. In other words, you don't think of the agency as the unit of competition, you think of the country, which is something I'll be talking about a little later this evening. Not too much later, because I know you want to get away early so you can engage in an exciting evening of sectarian violence. So I'll be as quick as I can. This thing of clouds and clocks comes from a paper written by the philosopher Karl Popper, which is, his very simple point is that there are effectively two sorts of mechanisms in the world. There are clocks at one extreme, which are highly mechanistic, very, very predictable, loved by engineers, broadly speaking, all about the laws of physics as perfectly expressed in something that's clock-like. At the other extreme, and of course there are things in between, there are things like clouds, which may, at some deep level, follow the laws of physics, but not to any level that makes them predictable or readily understandable. There's a very, very big, big difference between civil engineering and climatology in the degree of kind of predictability, proportion, and exactitude you find. But Popper's more interesting observation from this is he claimed that many of the world's greatest mistakes are made by people who take clouds and cloud problems and treat them as though they were clocks. So in other words, they treat something which is highly complex, like human behavior, for example, and they treat it as though it submits to kind of simple, deterministic engineering solutions. That's a cloud. That's the kind of area of physics which is perhaps very much at the clock extreme. The problem we all face is that most people from business and government, not our business, but most people from most businesses, come increasingly from the clock end of that spectrum. If you look at things like the shareholder value movement, that is absolutely a clockist's definition of what a great business should be about. And the idea that you should take a great business and reduce what it does down to one variable, which is actually generating value for shareholders and nothing else at all, is a spectacular piece of someone with an engineering background wanting to create a single metric. Now, of course, what a great business is really about is it's actually about the triangulation of 3 or more communities of interest, not least not only the stockholders, but also the people who work for it and the customers, the people who buy from it. And finding something which actually provides motivation for all 3 is where you produce a really, really great business. The really great businesses aren't actually about the narrow-minded pursuit of greed, they're about the pursuit of something extra, a kind of meta-ideal or a bigger ideal, which is why so many of the world's great brands are actually built by single, slightly mad individuals, whether it's Steve Jobs or Mr. Kellogg or Phil Knight at Nike or Branson at Virgin. To some extent, an extraordinary individual who's motivated perhaps by greed, but not only by greed, but by some other sense of mission, is far more likely to spawn a really interesting, enduring brand than a company that's all about balance sheet. And the economist John Kay makes this point brilliantly, when what John Kay says is that Marks and Spencer brought in, under some new management, a huge number of procurement specialists who fairly successfully drove down the prices they paid for their suppliers and gained them a few extra margin points. While they were doing that, he said, they were also destroying social capital built up with their suppliers that had perhaps taken 20 or 30 years to grow. And so in the pursuit of a few margin points, they destroyed extraordinarily valuable relationships of trust and reciprocity with their whole supplier community. It looked good in the third quarter. What damaging effect it might have had 2 or 3 years later is a completely different matter. But it's an interesting thing that the person who pioneered the shareholder value movement, Milton Friedman, who's it's often attributed to, is interestingly one of 5 or 6 famous people who is entirely amusical. You get a very small percentage of people who cannot understand. Fidel Castro is another one, interestingly, for whom it is impossible to distinguish between music and noise. And I think there might be something, Shakespeare said, never trust a man who loves not music, and I think there might be something there that might have been warning us. But this is what I talk about with what I call the clock tendency in business. In government, it tends to be lawyers. In business, it tends to be finance guys. But it's the same kind of thing. 24% of CEOs had a finance or accounting background in '96. That was 41% in 2002, dropping down slightly in 2005. Now, that mechanistic approach to the world has fairly wide-ranging effects. Let's play a game of Spot the Terrorists. Here are, whoops, I've given it away. Here are 5 possible university courses. Where would you expect to find Islamic fundamentalist terrorists most often? And actually, it's not in Islamic studies. That runs a very, very distant second. Easily first, it's the engineering department. And in fact, if you look at some of the statistics, probably about 30 to 40% of the people who've been involved as shoe bombers and other things have had an engineering background. And the first assumption was, well, you need these skills to do what they do. Not true at all. Actually, the Bader Meinhof were arts graduates to a man. They actually managed to blow things up quite effectively with, nice humanities degrees and that kind of thing. Also, most of the people with engineering backgrounds weren't involved in any kind of engineering function. And the statistics here, this is a piece from Slate, are absolutely astounding. They're about, these people are about 5 to 10 times more likely to do engineering. In fact, British intelligence notices that these people are actually actively targeting recruits among the engineering faculties of universities. The main reason being that the mindset among engineers that disdains ambiguity and compromise. They might be more passionate about bringing order to their society and see religious law, rigid religious law, as the best way of achieving this thing. So a very interesting thing, which is that I think our job, our broadest job, whatever business you're in, is actually to bring some sort of ambiguity to problem solving. A comfort with ambiguity and a comfort with clouds. And we are outnumbered in this, but I think our biggest definition as a job, whatever you do in any kind of marketing related field, is basically turning human understanding into business advantage. Or if you've got a government bit of business, it's turning human understanding into social advantage and benefit. And what's extraordinary is the number of people engaged in doing this seems to me terrifyingly small. It terrifies me when you look at the extent to which whole problems are defined by engineers before anybody else has a chance to look at them or debate them at all. And I believe we should actually become, as a community, we should become very, very opinionated. Instead of being different, I think we should actually start developing very strong opinions. As a marketing person, I'm violently opposed to the idea of high-speed rail. The idea that it's a good use of £15 billion, or rather the best use of £15 billion, to get to Birmingham 25 minutes earlier, strikes me as practically deranged. Okay? It's an engineering solution, which is how must we actually improve society? How can we improve a journey, take a numerical measure, duration, reduce it? And so what you're suddenly doing is it's a very convenient numerical measure, which actually correlates very badly with the pleasantness of a journey. If you make a list of the 10 most annoying things that pissed you off on your last rail trip, I'm fairly confident that duration didn't make it into the top 10. And that, don't get me wrong, if you're taking some rail trip of 15 hours, there might be a cause for bringing it down to 6 or 5. The difference, however, between a 2-hour rail journey and a 2-hour 25 rail journey or a 3-hour rail journey is actually immaterial in terms of human pleasure. You might also argue that actually, since the invention of Angry Birds makes the passage of time absolutely impossible to discern, all you actually need is to give the entire population iPads, and actually the trains can be as slow as you like. But the point I'm making here is that there's a very great danger of kind of numerical bias. Someone made a point, actually, an expert in human welfare and an expert in environmental concern, which really, really worried him, which is that it's a lot easier to measure mortality than it is to measure morbidity. So actually it's much, much easier to mention things like, death rates than it is to measure things like whether people are happy or whether people are sad. As a result, huge number of human indices are obsessed about longevity, whereas actually more important considerations, like how many people are actually suffering because they're difficult to measure, are therefore considered unimportant. This man, a guy called Meadows, one of his great campaigns was actually to get longevity reduced in importance on all the indices of human happiness. And this is the same question on the trains. It's very difficult to measure what is pleasant, enjoyable, and nice. Things like a table on the train, for example, so you can work and drink coffee. But there's no numerical measure you can attach to that in terms of its value. So as a result, people chase meaningless metrics which, because they're numerically expressible, are therefore deemed to be important. And that's what I mean by the kind of engineer's stranglehold that exists over much decision-making both in government and in business. Here's a guy who was nothing like this at all. And Keats, writing about Shakespeare, made the point in one of his letters that Shakespeare actually had a remarkable thing in writers and thinkers which he called a negative capability, which was the ability to describe and understand human behaviour without necessarily trying to attach it to any grand theory. He was happy actually not to try and distill any human behaviour down into a single thing. He was just happy to depict human life as a kind of panoply of interesting interactions. He was a cloud guy, not a clock guy. And they said what's remarkable about Shakespeare is that most writers try and actually develop mechanistic theories for how humans behave, and here's probably the greatest person of all at the business of depicting human psychology, and he didn't even try, which is kind of interesting.